You walk into a coffee shop, order a latte for $5 or $6, tap your card and walk out. It feels like one of the simplest businesses in America. Buy some coffee beans, hire a barista, sell drinks, keep the difference. But here's the strange part. A coffee shop can have customers lined up every morning, sell hundreds of drinks a day, and still struggle to make much money. So where does all that money go? Because the economics of a coffee shop are much more complicated than the price of a latte suggests. And once you follow that $5 payment all the way through the business, you start to see something surprising. The coffee itself is only one piece of the story. In fact, the real business isn't just selling coffee. It's selling convenience, location, habit, speed, experience, and most importantly, repeat transactions. And that's what makes the local coffee shop such an interesting business to understand. Coffee is already deeply embedded in American life. In 2026, the National Coffee Association reported that about 66% of American adults drink coffee on a given day, while nearly 195 million adults drink it during an average week. Specialty coffee has also become a major part of the market. National Coffee Association. But a coffee shop doesn't make money simply because Americans love coffee. It makes money if the economics of each transaction work. So let's follow the money. Imagine a small independent coffee shop. Maybe it's 200 square feet. There's a counter, an espresso machine, a few refrigerators, some tables, a pastry display, and enough space for a handful of employees. The owner might have spent somewhere around $150,000 to $350,000 getting the business open. That's not a universal number. It's a working estimate for the kind of neighborhood cafe we're analyzing, because the actual cost can vary dramatically depending on the city, the condition of the space, construction requirements, equipment, and whether the owner is buying an existing cafe or building one from scratch. And this is where people make their first mistake. They think the expensive part is the coffee equipment. It isn't necessarily. The money can disappear before the first cup is ever sold. You have construction, plumbing, electrical work, ventilation, counters, furniture, lighting, signage, point-of-sale systems, refrigeration, espresso machines, grinders, ice machines, water filtration, smallwares, permits, insurance, initial inventory. And then there's the expense that new owners frequently underestimate: cash. You need money to survive before the business becomes stable, because the coffee shop doesn't open on day one and magically operate at full capacity. Maybe the first month is slow, maybe the second month is better, maybe customers don't become regulars until month 3. Meanwhile, rent is due, employees still need to be paid, suppliers still need to be paid, utilities still arrive. The espresso machine doesn't care whether Tuesday was busy. The landlord doesn't care whether it rained all weekend. That's why working capital matters. The business needs enough cash to survive the gap between opening the doors and reaching sustainable sales. Now let's say our hypothetical shop is finally open. What does it actually sell? Obviously, coffee. But that's not the complete answer. A customer might buy a drip coffee for $3. Another buys a $6 latte. Someone adds an extra espresso shot. Someone buys a pastry. Another customer buys a breakfast sandwich. Someone orders an iced specialty drink. And suddenly, the coffee shop isn't really selling coffee. It's selling an average transaction. That's a much more important number. Suppose the average customer spends $7. If the shop serves 150 customers per day, that's 150 customers, $7 1,050 per day. Open 30 days, that's approximately $31,500 in monthly sales. Now increase the traffic to 250 customers per day, £150 $7 $1,150 per day. That's roughly $52,500 per month. Same building, same espresso machine, same basic business, but significantly different economics. And this is the first major lesson of the coffee business. Volume matters enormously. The owner isn't just trying to sell a great cup of coffee. They're trying to create a machine that repeatedly turns foot traffic into transactions. And that's why location is so important. A coffee shop doesn't have to convince the entire city to become a customer. It needs enough people nearby to develop a habit. The office worker who comes every morning, the parent who stops after dropping off the kids, the commuter who grabs an iced coffee before work, the student who stays for 2 hours. the neighborhood resident who walks over every Saturday. One customer isn't particularly valuable. A customer who returns 4 times a week is. And this is where the economics become more interesting. Let's take that $7 average transaction. Suppose, purely as a simplified estimate, that ingredients and packaging consume about $200 of that sale. That leaves roughly $5 before labor, rent, utilities, payment processing, insurance, marketing, repairs, and everything else. On the surface, that looks fantastic. But that $5 isn't profit. It's contribution toward the rest of the business. And this is where most people get coffee shop economics wrong. They look at the cost of beans and milk and think, I can sell this drink for $6 and the ingredients only cost a couple of dollars. That's an incredible margin. The math isn't wrong. The conclusion is, because the coffee shop isn't just paying for coffee, it's paying for the person making it, the building they're standing in, the electricity running the refrigerator, the espresso machine being serviced, the insurance protecting the business, the software processing the order, the credit card transaction, the cleaning, the trash, the marketing, the manager, the taxes, and the thousands of little expenses that don't appear inside the cup. Labor is one of the biggest economic forces in the business. A coffee shop requires people to be physically present when customers arrive. You can't completely automate the barista, and you can't easily tell customers, sorry, nobody is here until the sales volume improves. The shop has to be staffed before the revenue arrives. That's a dangerous characteristic of the business. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, wages across accommodation and food services were averaging around $20.50 per hour in mid-2026, although individual coffee shop workers and locations vary significantly. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and wages aren't the entire labor cost. There can also be payroll taxes, workers' compensation, benefits, training, scheduling inefficiencies, overtime, and management. So imagine our coffee shop has several employees covering the morning rush, afternoon traffic, opening, closing, cleaning, and preparation. Even when the shop isn't busy, somebody may need to be there. That's why labor productivity matters. If one barista can serve 10 customers during a slow period, that's one thing. If the same employee can handle 20 customers during a rush because the shop is designed efficiently, the economics improve dramatically. And that's one of the hidden advantages of a well-run coffee shop. Not necessarily higher prices, higher throughput. The faster the business can turn demand into completed transactions without destroying quality, the more revenue the same physical location can produce. Think about the espresso machine. It doesn't care whether the drink sells for $4 or $7. The building doesn't care. The refrigerator doesn't care. The rent doesn't care. Many of the shop's fixed costs stay relatively stable while sales increase. That's operating leverage. And this is where a good coffee shop can become interesting. Imagine the shop has monthly fixed operating costs of roughly $30,000. That's an illustrative assumption, not an industry average. Now suppose each customer contributes about $5 toward those fixed costs after direct product costs. To cover $30,000, the business would need $30,000 divided by $5. That's 6,000 transactions per month, or about 200 transactions per day. That is the break-even concept. Not how much coffee do we sell, but how many transactions do we need before the business starts paying for itself. Now imagine the shop gets only 150 customers a day. At $7 per transaction, that's $31,500 in monthly revenue. The business may be very close to break even. Maybe it makes a little money. Maybe it loses money. Maybe the owner is effectively working for free. But increase the traffic to 250 customers per day. Revenue becomes roughly $52,500. Now those additional transactions can be much more valuable because many fixed costs haven't increased proportionally. The shop doesn't need another building. It doesn't need another espresso machine every time sales increase. It may need more labor and more ingredients, but not necessarily in proportion to revenue. That's the operating leverage hiding inside the coffee business. And it's also why a small change in customer traffic can have a surprisingly large impact on profit. Now here's another important part of the story. Not every dollar of revenue is equal. A basic drip coffee might have very different economics from a breakfast sandwich. A latte has different ingredient costs from a pastry. A bottled drink has different labor requirements from a made-to-order specialty beverage. And food can be particularly interesting. Imagine someone comes in for a $5 latte. Then they see a $4 pastry. Their ticket becomes $9. The shop didn't necessarily need another customer. It simply increased revenue from the customer who was already standing there. That's powerful because customer acquisition is expensive. Getting someone through the door takes location, signage, reputation, social media, advertising, reviews, word of mouth, and sometimes discounts. Once the customer is already there, selling one additional item can be much easier. This is why menu engineering matters. The coffee shop wants products that customers actually want to buy, but it also wants a mix that works economically, and this creates another hidden business. The coffee shop is really operating several businesses inside one small room. There's the beverage business, the food business, the retail business, sometimes catering, sometimes packaged beans, sometimes merchandise, sometimes subscriptions, sometimes delivery, sometimes wholesale, and sometimes the business becomes a community space that indirectly creates more repeat demand. But there's a trap here. More revenue doesn't automatically mean more profit. Imagine the owner adds a complicated breakfast menu. Sales increase by $10,000 a month. Sounds great, but then food waste increases, kitchen labor increases, inventory becomes harder to manage, equipment requirements increase, prep time increases, and suddenly the extra $10,000 in revenue produces much less profit than expected. That's why good operators don't ask, "Can we sell more?" They ask, "Can we sell more profitably?" Now let's follow the money through a typical $7 transaction. Say the customer pays $7. Perhaps around $2 goes toward coffee, milk, syrup, food ingredients, cups, lids, and other direct product costs. That's a simplified estimate. Maybe another portion goes to payment processing. Then labor absorbs part of the sale, then rent, then utilities, then insurance, then maintenance, then software, then marketing, then taxes and other expenses. And whatever remains is the economic reward for owning and operating the business. That final number can be dramatically smaller than customers imagine. A shop doing $50,000 in monthly revenue is not necessarily putting $50,000 in the owner's pocket. That's revenue, not income, not profit, and definitely not cash the owner can freely spend. This distinction becomes extremely important when somebody says, "My coffee shop does $600,000 a year." That sounds impressive, but the real question is, how much remains after everything is paid? And then there's another question. How much of that is actually compensation for the owner's labor? Because a small business owner might report a healthy-looking profit while personally working 60 hours a week. If the owner has to be behind the counter every morning, close the store every night, manage suppliers, handle payroll, repair equipment, and solve employee problems, part of the economic return is really payment for a job. That's very different from owning an asset that generates income while someone else operates it. And this is where coffee shops become less attractive to passive investors. A coffee shop is operationally intensive. People matter, quality matters, speed matters, consistency matters, customer service matters, and small mistakes happen every day. One employee doesn't show up, a refrigerator breaks, a supplier raises prices, the espresso machine needs repair, a competitor opens across the street, the landlord increases rent, a rainy week destroys foot traffic, a major employer nearby moves out. These aren't theoretical problems, they're the daily economics of the business. Now consider rent. Rent can be one of the most important decisions the owner makes. A beautiful location with enormous foot traffic sounds perfect, but if the rent is too high, the location can become a trap. Imagine two coffee shops. Shop A pays $4,000 a month in rent and generates $40,000 in sales. Shop B pays $10,000 in rent and generates $70,000 in sales. Shop B has more revenue. But does it have the better business? Not necessarily. The answer depends on everything else. Labor, product mix, operating hours, debt, taxes, utilities, and the amount of sales generated per square foot. Because the building is an economic machine, the owner is effectively renting physical space and trying to convert that space into transactions. And that means every empty table, every unused hour, and every dead corner of the store represents unused economic capacity. Now imagine the shop opens at 6:30 in the morning. The rush hits. By 9 o'clock, it's packed. Then traffic drops. By 2 o'clock, the store is quiet. At 5 o'clock, maybe there's another small rush. The rent doesn't change at 2 o'clock. The espresso machine doesn't become cheaper. The insurance bill doesn't shrink. So the owner has to figure out how to monetize those slower periods. That's where things like afternoon drinks, food, remote workers, events, delivery, catering, and other revenue streams can matter. But again, there's a trade-off. A customer sitting at a table for 3 hours and buying one $5 coffee may be great for the brand. It may also be terrible for revenue per square foot. That's the tension between experience and economics. The coffee shop wants customers to feel comfortable, but the business also needs the physical space to produce enough revenue to justify its cost. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood assets in the entire business, the customer habit. A coffee shop doesn't just sell caffeine, it sells routine. If someone visits once, that's a transaction. If they visit every weekday for 5 years, that's a customer relationship worth thousands of dollars. Suppose someone spends $7 per visit and comes 4 times a week. That's $28 a week, roughly $1,456 a year. Over 5 years, that's more than $7,000 in spending from one customer before accounting for price changes and missed visits. Now multiply that by hundreds of regular customers. That's why brand matters. That's why consistency matters. That's why the barista remembering your order matters. And that's why a coffee shop can become extremely valuable when it becomes part of the neighborhood's routine. Now let's talk about debt. Imagine the owner borrowed $200,000 to open the store. The loan payment doesn't care whether sales are strong this month. Interest doesn't care. Principal doesn't care. The business must generate enough cash to cover those obligations. Debt can accelerate growth because it allows the owner to control a larger business without putting all of their own money into it. But it also creates a fixed claim on cash flow. If sales fall by 20%, the loan payment doesn't automatically fall by 20%. That's the danger. A business with strong margins and weak debt can survive a bad year. A business with thin margins and heavy debt can get into trouble very quickly. And coffee shops are particularly sensitive because they already have a lot of recurring operating expenses. Now imagine 3 versions of our hypothetical shop. In a bad year, the store gets only 140 transactions a day. At a $7 average ticket, that's about $29,400 a month. If the business was designed around $45,000 or $50,000 in monthly sales, the economics could become painful. The owner might cut hours, reduce staff, delay maintenance, negotiate with suppliers, or inject personal cash. Now take the normal scenario, maybe 210 transactions a day at a $7.50 average ticket. That's about $47,250 a month. The shop might cover its costs and generate a modest operating profit. Not spectacular, but sustainable. Now imagine the great year. 300 transactions a day. Average ticket rises to $8 because customers are buying more food and specialty drinks. That's $72,000 a month. Now the fixed costs become much less frightening relative to revenue. The business has more room to absorb problems. The owner can hire management, upgrade equipment, pay down debt, build cash reserves, or potentially open another location. That's the difference between a fragile coffee shop and a scalable coffee business. And this is where the big reveal appears. The secret to the coffee shop isn't actually the coffee. It's density of profitable transactions. The business works when enough customers repeatedly pass through a relatively small physical space, spend enough money each time, and generate enough gross profit to cover the fixed costs. The coffee is the product, but the economic engine is repetition. Location creates access, habit creates frequency, menu design increases ticket size, operational efficiency increases throughput, and fixed costs create operating leverage. Put those pieces together and you have a business. Remove one of them and the economics can collapse. A coffee shop in a perfect location with terrible service can fail. A beautiful cafe with insufficient traffic can fail. A busy shop with excessive rent can fail. A popular shop with poor labor management can fail, and a shop with great sales but massive debt can fail. This is why looking only at revenue tells you almost nothing. The real question is what happens between the customer's payment and the owner's bank account, because the money has to survive every layer in between. And there is another reason coffee shops are difficult. Commodity costs can move. Coffee beans don't have a fixed price forever. Milk changes, sugar changes, packaging changes, wages change, insurance changes, rent changes, and customers don't always accept price increases immediately. So the owner is constantly balancing two forces: raise prices too aggressively and customers may leave. Don't raise prices enough and margins disappear. That's pricing power. And a strong local brand has more of it. If customers believe every latte is interchangeable, they'll choose the cheaper option. If they believe your shop has better coffee, better service, a better location, a better experience, or simply fits their daily routine better, you have more room to charge a premium. That's why the strongest coffee shops are not really competing on beans alone. They're competing on convenience and identity. Now ask the bigger question: is a local coffee shop actually a good business? The answer is, it can be. But it is not automatically a high-margin business just because coffee has a high selling price relative to its raw ingredients. The upside can be attractive. A successful shop can generate recurring daily revenue, build a loyal customer base, create a recognizable local brand, and potentially become the foundation for additional locations or products. But the downside is real. Startup capital can be significant. Labor is unavoidable. Rent can destroy margins. Equipment can break. Competition can be intense. And the owner often has to be deeply involved. For the right operator, that can be an advantage. Someone who understands the neighborhood, controls costs, manages people well, creates a strong customer experience, and watches the numbers can build a very good business. For someone who simply thinks, people love coffee, so I'll open a cafe, that's a completely different story. Because the customers aren't buying the owner's dream, they're buying a drink. And the business survives only if the numbers behind that drink work. If you're enjoying these money breakdowns and want to see how ordinary businesses turn everyday transactions into real profits, subscribe to Money Behind. Because sometimes the most interesting financial stories are hiding in the businesses we walk past every day. And that may be the most important lesson from the local coffee shop. The business you see is only the surface. You see the espresso machine, the wooden tables, the pastries, the latte art, the line of customers. But underneath all of that is a financial machine. Every customer represents revenue. Every drink has a cost. Every employee consumes part of the margin. Every square foot has an economic purpose. Every loan creates a claim on cash flow. Every empty hour represents unused capacity. And every regular customer represents future revenue. So the next time you walk into your local coffee shop and pay $6 for a latte, don't just ask whether the coffee is worth $6. Ask a different question. How many dollars actually survive after the coffee, milk, cup, employee, rent, electricity, credit card fees, maintenance, taxes, debt, and everything else take their share? Because that's where the real business begins. The coffee is what you bought. The economics are what you didn't see. And that's the money behind your local coffee shop.